The October rain came down without a single warning. Not the kind of romantic drizzle often seen in movies, but a heavy, relentless, bone-chilling downpour, so dense it felt as if the sky itself was furious on someone's behalf. Daniel Harrison stood on the front steps of the small two-story house he had bought with a 30-year mortgage. Under the yellow glow spilling from the living room window, his face hardened, not with sadness, not exactly with anger, but with a blend of weariness, resentment, and the cold conviction that he was doing what had to be done. The last suitcase lay at his feet. Daniel bent down and gripped the leather handle. With a sharp swing of his arm, he hurled it forward. The suitcase spun through the air, struck the edge of the steps, then crashed onto the rain-soaked street. A dry, cracking sound echoed as the leather split open from the impact. In that moment, Daniel did not think about the fact that the suitcase was not a knockoff, as he had always believed. He did not think about its value. He did not think about what was inside. He thought only of one thing, that at last, everything was over. Behind him, from the wide-open doorway, laughter rang out. It was clear, sharp, almost crystalline, like the clinking of glass. Victoria leaned against the doorframe, draped in an expensive coat, her luxurious perfume mingling with the scent of rain and wet asphalt. She watched the scene before her with obvious delight, as if this were a performance she had been waiting months to see. "Finally," Victoria chuckled softly, her voice drawn out, dripping with pleasure. "I honestly don't understand how you managed to put up with her for 3 whole years." Daniel did not respond. He stood there, his arm still suspended in the air after the throw. Part of him knew he should turn back, should say something, but the other part, the one desperate to prove himself, to escape the feeling of being constrained, won. At the end of the driveway, under the pouring rain, Elena stood. She did not run. She did not bend down to pick up the suitcase. She did not scream, cry, or beg, just as Daniel had expected, and perhaps secretly hoped she would. The simple maternity dress she wore, one sold at discount stores, clung to her body, soaked through by the rain. Her 6-month pregnant belly was unmistakably visible, a reminder Daniel had deliberately ignored for weeks. Rain streamed down Elena's face, blending with droplets that made it impossible for an outsider to tell whether they were rain or tears. But the truth was, she was no longer crying. If someone had looked closely, they would have noticed her eyes, eyes that held none of the panic of someone who had just lost everything. Instead, there was something unsettlingly calm about them. In that gaze, something flickered briefly, a trace of pity. Then it vanished, replaced by silent calculation. 36 months. For 36 months, Elena had lived in that house like a shadow. She played the role of the perfect poor wife, wearing makeup bought from drugstores, dressing in clothes from second-hand shops, carefully clipping every discount coupon, cooking frugal meals, just enough. She never complained, never demanded anything, never mentioned a single thing about her family. Daniel had believed, had even taken pride in the belief, that he was the one saving her. A man steadily climbing the career ladder, bringing along a wife who had nothing but gratitude. He never once asked himself why a woman as intelligent as Elena would accept that kind of life. "Look at her," Victoria continued, her voice tinged with disdain. "Just standing there like a statue. Not even bothering to fight back. How pathetic." Daniel looked down. Elena remained motionless. One hand rested lightly on her belly, instinctively protecting the unborn child. The other hung loosely at her side, not clenched, not trembling. There was something about her posture that made Daniel uneasy. She did not appear to be someone who had just been evicted from her home. She looked like someone who was observing. Fragments of memory flickered through Daniel's mind. The first day he met Elena at the community college. She was a scholarship student, and he was a part-time lecturer pursuing an MBA. She was quiet, attentive, and always seated in the front row. The day she smiled at him after class, Daniel had felt as if he had won something. 6 months later, he proposed with a modest ring, one he had saved for 4 months to afford. Elena said yes immediately. No demands for a grand wedding, no concern for the ring's value. Back then, Daniel had thought, "At last I've found a woman who understands." Now, standing in the cold rain, that memory returned, carrying an entirely different feeling. Not pride, but confusion. The door behind them suddenly opened wider. Margaret Harrison, Daniel's mother, appeared. As always, she was impeccably put together. Her silver hair was neatly styled, her expensive coat utterly unsuited for the weather. On her face was the familiar air of self-importance Daniel had known all his life, the gaze of someone who always believed herself superior to others. Margaret stepped onto the porch, brushing past Victoria without so much as a glance. Her eyes locked onto Elena, sharp enough to make the air feel heavier. "So this is your true face, is it?" Her voice rang out, cutting through the rain. "Running away when things get difficult. Exactly what I'd expect from someone with such a lowly background." Daniel had heard that tone many times. For 3 years, it had always been directed at Elena, but never had it sounded so naked, so cruel. Elena did not respond. She simply lifted her head and looked straight at her mother-in-law. In that instant, Daniel realized something strange. Elena was not bowing her head, not out of arrogance, but because she did not see herself as inferior. The rain continued to fall, cold and heavy, yet somehow it no longer felt like the most terrifying thing that night, because at that very moment, when the shattered suitcase lay in the street, when the mistress's laughter still echoed behind him, when his mother was preparing to unleash her cruelest words, something inside Elena quietly came to an end, and at the same time, something else was beginning. It wasn't that everything only began to crack on that rainy night. The truth was, Daniel and Elena's marriage had carried fractures from the very first day, carefully concealed, so well hidden that no one, not even Daniel himself, was willing to face them. 3 years earlier, Elena had entered that house with exactly 2 suitcases. No designer labels, no jewelry, not a single sign of abundance. She smiled gently at her mother-in-law on the day they first met, lowering her head just enough to show respect, but not low enough to lose her dignity. Even then, Margaret Harrison had looked her up and down with the gaze of someone appraising an object, and instantly reached her conclusion: unworthy. Daniel did not notice it, or perhaps he did, but chose to ignore it. Elena quickly learned how to survive in that space. She woke up earlier than everyone else, cooked simple breakfasts, and kept the house spotless, so clean that no one could find fault with it. When Margaret complained that the food was bland, Elena merely smiled and quietly adjusted the recipe the next time. When her mother-in-law remarked that her daughter-in-law had no sense of style, Elena nodded and continued wearing simple clothes, as though she had never known any other choice. She did not argue, did not resist, did not explain. Daniel took that as pleasantness. He told his friends how lucky he was to have a wife who was low maintenance, undemanding, and free of pressure. A woman who knew how to be satisfied with what she was given. He never realized that this so-called pleasantness was, in fact, a conscious decision, a role maintained through extraordinary patience. Elena chose to become invisible. She concealed her education by never showing off her achievements. She hid her financial knowledge by letting Daniel believe he was the only one who understood money. She even concealed her ability to read people, an ability that had allowed her to realize early on that Daniel loved the feeling of being admired more than he loved his own wife. At times, Daniel did feel something was odd. Moments when Elena glanced at the bank statements and asked just one question, gentle yet uncannily precise, or when she suggested postponing a particular expense for reasons that sounded emotional, only to later prove entirely correct. Daniel chalked it up to luck, or female intuition. He never thought any deeper. Then Victoria appeared. At first, they were just meetings for work, evenings when Daniel came home later saying he had to entertain clients and expand his network. Elena did not ask much, did not grow jealous, did not check his phone. She simply observed and remembered. She knew about Victoria after just 3 weeks, not because Daniel slipped up, but because Elena understood people. Daniel began criticizing his wife more subtly. The way he compared without ever naming names, the way he spoke about women who know how to take care of themselves was with a strangely bright look in his eyes. Elena noticed everything and remained silent, not out of weakness, but because she wanted to know how far things would go. Margaret, of course, noticed the change even sooner. She seemed pleased when Daniel mentioned Victoria, even in passing. A woman of the right class, she said. Someone who knew how to present herself beside a successful man. Elena heard those words standing right there in the room and continued washing the dishes as if they did not exist. 3 years passed like that. Elena became pregnant in the 14th month of her marriage. When the pregnancy test showed 2 lines, she sat in the bathroom for a long time, one hand resting on her belly, not to celebrate, but to think. What kind of family would this child be born into? A family where kindness only existed when it was convenient? That was when she called her father. The call was not dramatic, no tears, just the truth, spoken plainly, sentence by sentence, precise and composed. Thomas Wellington listened to everything, from the barbed remarks of her mother-in-law to her husband's betrayal to the quiet loneliness his daughter had endured. He wanted to intervene immediately. Elena stopped him. "Give me more time," she said. "I want to be sure. I want to know whether, in the worst circumstances, they would choose kindness or not." Thomas agreed, though he was far from satisfied. He knew his daughter well enough to understand that when Elena made that decision, it was not an impulsive one. It was a test. And that test lasted nearly 2 more years. During that time, Elena continued to be the proper wife. She did not expose Victoria, did not confront Daniel, did not demand change. She let everything reveal itself little by little, the way time always does with the truth. Daniel, meanwhile, grew increasingly convinced that he had escaped an unworthy wife. He took Elena's silence as proof that she had no other options. He never realized that it was precisely that silence which gave him enough rope to hang himself. And then, the rainy night arrived. Everything Elena had observed, recorded, and waited for converged in the moment Margaret spat in her face. At that point, the test was over, not because of the humiliation, but because of Daniel's reaction. He stood still, not out of fear, but out of calculation. In that instant, Elena saw everything she needed to know. No more doubt, no lingering hope that things might somehow be different. The man she had once believed to be kind no longer existed. Or perhaps he had never existed at all. That was why, when the suitcase was thrown into the rain, Elena did not bend down to pick it up. Because to her, what had just fallen was not luggage. It was the last illusion. And when that illusion disappeared, what remained was not pain, but clarity. Elena was ready for the next step, not for revenge, not to humiliate anyone, but to end it. There are moments in life that are not loud, that need no background music, no guiding narration. They arrive quietly, so quietly that if you are not paying attention, you will miss them. But once they happen, everything that follows leaves no room for turning back. Margaret Harrison stood beneath the porch, only a few steps away from Elena. Rain struck the concrete, forming scattered puddles that reflected the yellow light spilling from the living room. She was in no hurry. She never hurried when facing people she believed to be beneath her. In Margaret's eyes, Elena was not a person. She was merely a mistake, a stain on the perfect life Margaret had designed for her son. 3 years, Margaret said, each word emphasized like a verdict already written. 3 years I've watched you drag my son down. No style, no ambition, no connections. What have you brought him besides mediocrity? Daniel stood directly behind his mother, only a few steps away, yet so distant that Elena felt as if he were standing on the other side of the world. She did not turn back to look at him. She did not need to. She already knew. Victoria stood close beside Daniel, her hand resting on his arm, a mark of possession that needed no concealment. Each time Margaret spoke, the corner of Victoria's lips curved upward, ever so slightly, ever so briefly. The smile of someone who believed she was standing on the winning side. Elena listened to everything with a calmness that surprised even herself. Not because she felt nothing, on the contrary, a violent storm churned inside her chest, but it had been compressed through months, years of observation and endurance. She remembered the family dinners where Margaret always found some small detail to criticize. She remembered how Margaret used the word we when speaking of the Harrison family, and you when speaking to Elena, as if Elena had never truly belonged. She remembered the times Daniel laughed it off or changed the subject, treating it as if it were something insignificant. Not because he didn't notice, but because he didn't want to upset his mother. Margaret took another step forward. The distance between her and Elena was now close enough to hear each other's breathing. Elena caught the scent of expensive perfume mixed with cold rain. Her hand instinctively rested on her belly, where the child stirred faintly, a tiny movement, but enough to remind her that she was not alone. "Look at you," Margaret continued, her voice higher, sharper, "standing there like a victim. Do you think that makes me pity you?" No one stopped her. No one said, "That's enough." Daniel opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. In that brief moment, Elena saw the hesitation clearly on her husband's face. Not fear, but calculation. Calculating whether to protect his wife or keep the peace with his mother. Calculating how this reaction might affect Victoria. Calculating, weighing, and delaying. Elena understood then that very hesitation was the choice. Margaret tilted her head, her gaze filled with contempt. "You disgust me," she said slowly, each syllable sharpened to cause pain. "You make me sick." And then it happened. Not quickly, not unexpectedly, but deliberately. Margaret leaned forward slightly, a minimal, very ordinary motion, as if she were about to say something more, but instead of words, a drop of saliva fell from her lips, striking Elena's left cheek just beneath her eye. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The rain kept falling. The porch light stayed on. Victoria was still there. Daniel was still there. Yet everything felt distant, as though Elena were watching the scene through thick glass. The spit slid slowly down her skin, blending with the rain. A cold sensation spread, not only across her cheek but through her entire body. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Something broke inside his chest, not love, but the belated realization that his mother had just crossed a line that could never be erased. Elena did not move. She did not raise her hand to wipe it away, did not step back, did not lift her arm. She stood still, too still. And then she smiled. Not a wide smile, not a provocative one, just the faintest curve at the corner of her lips, yet it sent a deeper chill through Daniel than any scream could have. That was not the smile of someone who had been humiliated. It was the smile of someone who had just made a final decision. Elena slowly raised her hand and wiped the saliva from her cheek. Her movement was so composed that it unsettled Margaret for a brief moment. There were no tears, no trembling, only calm. 36 months, Elena said softly, her voice low and clear, loud enough for everyone to hear. 36 months I have been here, observing, waiting. Margaret frowned. What are you talking about? Elena did not answer immediately. She looked at each of them in turn, Margaret, Daniel, then Victoria. Her gaze held no anger, no resentment, only clarity. There are things, Elena continued, that require only a single moment to end. Daniel wanted to say something, anything, an apology, a plea to stop, but his throat felt constricted. He realized that all this time he had grown accustomed to Elena enduring everything, and now that she was no longer, he had no idea how to face it. Margaret gave a cold laugh. Do you think a smile can change your position? Elena shook her head slightly. No, she said. I don't want to change my position. I only want to confirm that it was never mine. She slipped her hand into the pocket of her thin coat, the coat now soaked through by rain. When her fingers touched the familiar cold object inside, her heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from certainty. This was the moment when every test ended, the moment when silence was no longer necessary. Elena pulled out her phone. Not the kind Daniel recognized. The metallic sheen glinting beneath the porch light made Victoria narrow her eyes. A small detail, but enough to seed unease in the air. Elena glanced at the screen for a moment, then she looked up. The rain was still falling, but now it was no longer a rain of humiliation. It was the rain of an ending, and also a beginning. Elena looked at the phone screen for a single, very brief breath. Not out of hesitation, but because she wanted to be sure that this moment, when it happened, would not be rushed. The rain continued to fall steadily, cold and heavy. Droplets slid down her wrist, seeped through the fabric of her coat, and soaked into her skin. Yet that cold no longer reached the deepest part of her, because there, everything had already become clear. Elena lifted the phone to her ear. "Hello, Dad," she said. Her voice was so calm that it took Daniel aback. No trembling, no catching in her throat, none of the raw emotion of someone who had just been humiliated. It was the voice of someone who had thought for a very long time and had finally made a decision. "I think it's time," Elena continued. "Yes, now. There's no need to wait any longer." She interrupted the person on the other end with a slight nod, as if speaking face to face. "It's okay, I'm fine. The baby is fine too, but I think I need you to come here." A silence fell over the front yard of the small house. Margaret Harrison narrowed her eyes. She couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but her instinct, the instinct of someone who had spent her entire life reading people, began to sound a vague warning bell. Something was wrong. Not because Elena was making a call, but because of how she was making it. No pleading, no explaining, no need to persuade. As if the person on the other end had always been ready. "What kind of act are you putting on now?" Margaret spoke up, trying to conceal the flicker of unease that had just surfaced. "Who are you calling? Your poor little family?" Elena did not turn around. She kept the phone to her ear, her gaze fixed through the curtain of rain where the streetlights blurred into hazy halos. You already know the address, she continued. Yes, I'll wait. She ended the call. No further explanation, no dramatic declaration, just a small action, but enough to make the air around them feel compressed, taut. Daniel swallowed hard. A strange sensation crept along his spine, the feeling of someone who had just realized he was standing before something beyond his control. He looked at his mother, then at Victoria. Neither of them retained their earlier confidence. "Who did you call?" Victoria asked, her voice a little higher than usual. The hand gripping Daniel's arm tightened unconsciously, as if searching for support. Elena turned around. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked directly at Victoria. Her gaze was not hostile, not contemptuous, only indifferent. The indifference of someone who had already placed the final period. "Not related to you," Elena said. Her voice remained gentle, but there was no room for argument. Margaret let out a stiff laugh. "You think making a phone call can scare anyone?" she said, trying to reclaim her authority. "This is my son's house." Elena tilted her head slightly as if weighing the words. "Yes," she replied. "For now." The answer was too calm, too precise, and that was precisely what made Margaret suddenly uneasy. She didn't know why, but inside her, a cold sensation began to spread, like standing at the edge of a cliff without realizing you were about to slip. Daniel looked at Elena, searching for something familiar. Submission, patience, the silence that had once made him feel safe. But there was nothing. The woman standing before him now did not resemble the wife he thought he had understood for 3 years. "What are you doing?" Daniel finally asked. His voice came out hoarse. "You don't need to." Elena cut him off with a very slight shake of her head. "Daniel," she said, calling his name for the first time that night. "I have needed to, for a very long time." There was no accusation in the sentence, and precisely because of that, it hurt more than any reproach. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The rain grew heavier. Droplets struck the porch roof in a steady rhythm like the ticking of a countdown. Daniel suddenly realized that he was counting. He didn't know whether he was counting time or counting what he was about to lose. Margaret crossed her arms over her chest, trying to maintain a hardened front, but her hands trembled slightly. She hated this feeling, the feeling of not knowing what she was facing. "Let's go inside," she said, her voice commanding. "She's just trying to get attention." Elena smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "I think we should stay out here." Had she just called her mother? Margaret froze. That word, small as it was, struck somewhere deep in her memory, a vague fragment, a surname, a story she had once heard in passing during the rumor-filled afternoon teas of high society. Wellington. The thought flashed through Margaret's mind too quickly for her to grasp, but her body reacted before her reason could dismiss it. Her heart began to race, her breathing grew shallow. "You," Margaret began, but the word caught in her throat. Elena stood still, one hand resting on her belly, the other hanging loosely at her side. She did not need to say more, did not need to do anything else, because from the moment she ended the call, everything had already been set in motion. Daniel looked at his wife, no, at the woman carrying his child, and for the first time, a truly terrifying thought took hold of him. What if he was wrong? What if everything he had believed for 3 years, that Elena needed him, that she was beneath him, that he had the right to choose, was nothing but an illusion? The rain suddenly seemed quieter, not because it had eased, but because Daniel could no longer hear it. His ears rang as if the world were slowly withdrawing its sound, making space for a decisive moment. Somewhere out on the street, a set of headlights passed by, reflecting off the wet pavement. Then another set appeared. Elena looked in that direction, her expression unsurprised. Margaret followed her gaze. A chilling premonition ran down her spine. "Daniel," she whispered, for the first time, without command, in her voice. "Do you know who she is?" Daniel shook his head. But inside him, an answer was beginning to take shape, an answer he did not dare to speak. Elena turned to Margaret. Her gaze lingered long enough for every memory, every trace of contempt, every tear that had never fallen to be seen, and then closed. "You're about to find out," Elena said. And in that moment, as the headlights drew closer through the rain, as the air thickened with anticipation, Daniel understood something far too late. Tonight was not the night Elena was thrown out of the house. Tonight was the night the truth walked in. The first set of headlights appeared at the end of the street like a blurred streak of light through the curtain of rain, then a second, a third. Elena showed no sign of surprise. She stood still, one hand resting on her belly, the other hanging loosely at her side, as if this moment had been scheduled long ago, only no one but her had known. Daniel squinted toward the road. The vehicles approached slowly and steadily, without honking, without haste. There was nothing flashy about them, yet they were unmistakable. The way they moved carried a cold sense of order, making the space in front of the small house suddenly feel confined. Margaret was the first to sense it. She took half a step back, almost instinctively. It had been a long time since she had found herself retreating before anyone. But now her heart was pounding uncomfortably fast. A vague, nameless fear crept into every corner of her thoughts. "What is that?" Victoria asked softly. Her voice no longer carried the mockery from earlier. The hand gripping Daniel tightened, no longer possessive, but clinging. The first car stopped right at the gate, a black SUV, gleaming despite being drenched in rain. The door opened silently. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his movements crisp and decisive. His eyes swept quickly across the surroundings, not searching, but confirming. The second car stopped behind it, then the third. 3 black vehicles lined up in front of the ordinary 2-story house, the house Daniel had once thought symbolized his success. In that moment, it looked smaller than ever. Margaret drew in a deep breath. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice no longer steady. "Do you know who they are?" Daniel shook his head. His throat was dry. Part of him wanted to step forward, to say something, to reclaim control, but his feet seemed glued to the cold, rain-soaked concrete. The door of the 4th car opened. This one was different from the others, not larger, not louder, just different in the way it carried the feeling. A feeling of weight, as though every gaze was instinctively drawn toward it. A man stepped out. He was in his 60s, his silver hair neatly kept, his posture straight. The suit he wore did not need to be new or ostentatious to signal status. It fit him almost perfectly. An umbrella was quickly brought over, positioned above his head with meticulous care. Daniel felt his heartbeat falter. The man did not look at Daniel, did not look at Victoria, did not look at Margaret. His gaze stopped on Elena. In that moment, everything else seemed to blur. No rain, no lights, only the few meters between 2 people, one standing in the rain, clothes soaked through, and one who had just stepped out of a luxury car. "Elena," he said. Just one word. Not raised, not reproachful, yet enough to send a chill down Daniel's spine. Elena lifted her head. And then something happened that left Daniel frozen. She smiled. Not a polite smile, not a smile of endurance, but a warm, genuine smile, the smile of a daughter seeing the father she trusted completely. "Dad," she replied. Her voice had changed. very subtly yet unmistakably. Gone was the rigid restraint of the woman who had just been humiliated, realizing Daniel had never heard such a thing in 3 years of marriage. The man stepped closer. The umbrella was carefree before covering itself. A small detail, but one that causes Centraniel's chest to tighten. "You're soaked," they realized, an authority that did not need to be asserted. "Centra fine," Elena replied. "The baby is fine too." Daniel realized, swallowed, realized, made him realize that for a long time now, he had no longer been the center of her world. The man gave a slight nod, then his eyes, now for the first time, swept over the others. Daniel felt as though he had been placed under a microscope. Not an angry look, not a threatening one, but the gaze of someone assessing, and not particularly impressed. "This is," he asked, without raising his voice. Elena did not answer right away. She turned to Daniel, then to Margaret, then to Victoria. Her gaze was no longer uncertain. It was clear, lucid. "The family I tried to believe in," she said softly, "and the reason I called you." Margaret went pale. That word, Dad, rang in her head like a belated alarm. She opened her mouth wanting to say something, but could not find the right words. For the first time in her life, her familiar pride failed to hold her upright. "Tried to believe?" the man repeated, turning his real head. "I've just seen enough." Another realize of composed. She said nothing, only draped a thick coat centered Adir's with such care it was as if every raindrop in the world were her fault for letting her daughter stand out here too long. Daniel realized his hands were trembling. The man, Elena's father, turned and looked straight at Margaret. "You are his mother?" he asked, inclining his head slightly toward Daniel. Margaret nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." A silence fell. No one spoke. Yet in that silence, Margaret felt herself shrinking. She realized that all the social rules she had relied on, every hierarchy, every connection, no longer mattered here. "What did you say to my daughter tonight?" the man asked. His voice remained calm, but that very calm made the question more terrifying than any shout could have been. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it again. She looked at Daniel as if seeking help, but Daniel could not meet her eyes. He lowered his head. Elena placed her hand on her father's arm. "Dad," she said softly, "I don't think there's any need to repeat it." The man looked down at her hand, then nodded. "Very well." Just one word, yet it carried a decision. He turned to the man standing nearby, likely the head of security. "We'll stay for a while," he said. "I want to hear everything." No one objected. No one dared. The rain began to lighten, but the air grew heavier than ever. Daniel stood there, feeling as though the ground beneath his feet was shifting. He understood something at last, late but with absolute clarity. What he had believed to be power was only an illusion. What stood before him now was real. And in the moment Elena stood beside her father, sheltered by an umbrella and a protective gaze, Daniel realized. Tonight was not only the night the truth appeared. Tonight, it was the night the balance was reset. No one ordered silence, yet everyone was silent. The rain had eased, reduced to fine droplets falling evenly onto the road. Still, the air in front of the two-story house felt so heavy it seemed almost tangible. Daniel stood beneath the porch with the sensation that every exit had been sealed, not by doors, but by truth. The man standing beside Elena, her father, spoke little. He simply stood there, posture straight, one hand resting lightly on the umbrella, his gaze calm, yet utterly unsoftened. It was the gaze of someone accustomed to making decisions that could silence an entire boardroom, someone who had heard enough excuses to know when they were meaningless. He turned to Daniel. You, he said, his voice no louder than the rain, is my daughter's husband. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. The word yes lodged in his throat. For the first time in his life, the title husband carried no pride, only a mirror reflecting everything he had done and everything he had failed to do. 3 years, the man continued. 3 years you lived with her. He was not asking, he was stating a fact. In those 3 years, he said slowly, how many times did you let her stand alone? The question fell like a heavy stone. Daniel could not answer, because if he began counting, he would not know where to stop. Elena stood still. She did not look at Daniel. She did not look at her mother-in-law either. Her gaze rested ahead on the rainwater pooling on the street, reflecting the lights in trembling streaks. She had passed the moment when she needed to speak. Now was the time to listen. The man gave a slight nod as though he had expected that silence. He extended his hand. Another man, likely an assistant, stepped forward and placed a thin folder into it. Not thick. It did not need to be. We'll clarify a few things, he said. Not to humiliate, but to end this. He opened the folder without haste. You bought this house with a 30-year loan, he said without looking up, at an interest rate nearly 20% higher than the market. Margaret flinched. She was about to object, but the man needed only a glance, barely noticeable, for her to fall silent. She began to understand that from this moment on, no one here had the authority to define reality anymore. That loan, he continued, was guaranteed through a financial structure you did not understand. That in itself is not shameful, but believing that you did understand is. Daniel felt a ringing in his ears. The numbers, those things he had once been proud to believe he controlled, now became scattered fragments hanging loosely in the air. The house, the man said, turning another page, is owned by an independent legal entity. That entity is controlled by my daughter. Margaret sucked in a sharp breath. Victoria released Daniel's arm and took a step back as though the ground beneath her had suddenly become unsafe. Daniel shook his head slowly. That's impossible. It's possible, the man replied, and it has been that way from the beginning. Elena closed her eyes for a single breath, not from pain, but from a strange sensation. Relief. Once spoken aloud, the truth no longer weighed on her. The man continued. Your job? The company you work for? Daniel looked up, clinging to what felt like a final lifeline. That's my job. I was hired. That company, the man cut in, was acquired 8 months ago. No outward changes, no major announcement, but ownership changed. He looked directly at Daniel. The new owner is my family. There was no thunder, no dramatic music. Only the rain grew quieter, and a man realizing that everything he believed to be a foundation had merely been a stage. Victoria stepped back again, her face drained of color. The mockery from earlier was gone without a trace. All that remained was the raw confusion of someone who had just realized she had placed the wrong bet. The apartment you rented for her, the man went on, without pointing. Paid in cash, carefully. No paper trail. Daniel jolted. You can't. I can, the man said. And I did. He did not raise his voice, yet each word struck like a hammer, hitting the dark corners Daniel thought he had concealed. My daughter knew, the man said. She knew very early. Daniel turned to Elena. For the first time that night, he truly looked at her. You knew everything? Elena nodded. 3 weeks, she said softly. After the first time. The sentence was simple, but it brought an entire past crashing down. Daniel realized that all this time, it had not been him hiding things from Elena. It had been Elena giving him enough time to reveal himself. "She gave you chances," the man said. "Not once, many times." He closed the folder. "Chances to choose kindness, to stand by your wife, to choose to be a decent human being." Margaret trembled. We didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "If we had known." The man looked at her. "If you had known," he repeated, "would you have behaved differently?" Margaret fell silent because the answer, though unspoken, was painfully clear. "No," he said for her. "You would have only been more careful." No one contradicted him. The man turned to Elena. "Do you want to say anything?" Elena opened her eyes. She looked at Daniel, then at her mother-in-law, then at Victoria. There was no resentment in her gaze. It was transparent, like water after rain. "I didn't stay for 3 years to punish anyone," she said. "I stayed because I hoped I was wrong." She rested her hand on her belly. "I hoped this child would grow up in a family that knew how to love. I hoped that one day people would choose what was right." Daniel lowered his head. A drop fell, whether rain or tears. He could not tell. "But tonight," Elena continued, "when she spat in my face and you stood still, I knew it was enough." The man nodded. "Enough," he said. He turned to Daniel. "You will vacate this house within 72 hours. Daniel looked up, panicked. "What about—" "Your job," the man said, "ends today." No anger, no sarcasm. Just an ending delivered in a calm voice, the kind that makes it clear there is no room for negotiation. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. She realized that in this story, she had never been the main character. Just a detail, and now that detail had been crossed out. Margaret sank onto the steps, her coat soaked through, her eyes empty. The titles, the connections, the parties, all of it flashed before her like a fast-forwarded film, and then went dark. Elena stepped forward and stood beside her father. The coat was pulled tighter around her shoulders, not to display victory, but to keep warm. "Let's go," she said softly. The man nodded, and in the moment they turned and walked away without looking back, Daniel understood one final truth, painful yet unmistakable. The greatest collapse is not losing your house, your job, or your money. It is the moment you realize you have lost the best thing in your life by your own hand, in silence. Elena did not turn back. She walked slowly, each step steady on the rain-soaked path, as if every footfall were a decision carefully considered long ago. The coat wrapped around her shoulders, yet the cold wind still slipped through, touching her skin, a sensation so real, so ordinary, reminding her that tonight was not a dream. The convoy started its engines, a low, even hum. Red taillights reflected on the wet pavement, stretching into trembling lines like fragile threads connecting past and present. Then, one by one, they departed, orderly and silent. There were no goodbyes. There was no need. Because for Elena, everything that needed to be said had already been said. Daniel stood motionless beneath the porch, feeling as though the gravity holding him upright had been pulled away. His body remained there, but his mind swayed, adrift in a nameless void. He watched the lights fade, not to hold on, but because he no longer knew where else to look. Victoria let go of his arm. "Not because she had suddenly gained clarity. But out of survival instinct, the grip that had once signaled possession now felt like a burden. She stepped back half a pace, then another, as if afraid that standing too close would cause this collapse to swallow her as well. "Daniel," she said, her voice small and thin, nothing like the sharp laughter from earlier. Did you know about this?" Daniel did not answer. He could not, because to answer would mean admitting something more terrifying than any truth just revealed, that he had never known who his wife truly was, and had never honestly tried to. Margaret sat on the steps, her hands slack at her sides, her eyes fixed on the space ahead. Her hair was soaked, strands clinging to her forehead, exposing the wrinkles she had always tried to conceal. In this moment, she no longer resembled the woman who entered rooms like a queen. She looked suddenly old. "Wellington," she whispered, as if speaking to herself.
"The girl. She's a Wellington." The name hung in the air, heavy as stone. Daniel turned to look at his mother. For the first time in his life, he saw no certainty in her, only fear. A fear that was not loud or panicked, but deep, smoldering, and rooted. We spat in his daughter's face," Margaret continued, her voice trembling. "Do you understand? The pregnant daughter of Thomas Wellington." Daniel closed his eyes. That name, Thomas Wellington, was no longer a line in the news or a name spoken at lavish parties. It had become something living, standing right in front of him, looking straight at him, and then turning away. A hollowness spread through Daniel's chest, not the sharp pain of immediate loss, but a slow, quiet ache, like realizing you've been lost for far too long and no longer know where to begin turning back. The front door was still open. The living room lights were still on. The sofa where Elena used to sit reading in the evenings was still there. The teacup she often used still rested on the table, as if stepping inside might restore everything to normal. But Daniel knew there was no normal to return to. He stepped down one stair, then stopped. His expensive shoes were soaked through. Rainwater seeped in through the soles, biting cold. That sensation, simple, raw, made him realize something bitter. This was the first time all night he truly felt the rain. Victoria stood near the doorway, arms crossed, her gaze unsettled. She looked at Daniel, then at Margaret, then at the house. Calculations raced through her mind, calculations she had always believed she was good at. However, this time they yielded no favorable results. I think I should go," Victoria said, uncertain. No one stopped her. She stepped off the porch, her heels slipping slightly on the wet ground. She did not look back. Not out of pride, but because she understood that in this story, her role had ended the moment the name Wellington was spoken. Daniel watched her leave. Part of him wanted to call out, but he didn't, because he knew that even if he did, it would only prolong something already dead. Margaret slowly stood up. Gripping the railings, she moved into the house step by heavy step. The warm lights inside no longer felt safe. Everything familiar suddenly seemed foreign, as if she were entering a place where she no longer held power. "Daniel," she said, turning back to her son, "what do we do now?" That question, coming from the woman who had always had an answer for everything, made Daniel's throat tighten. He did not know how to respond, because for the first time, he honestly did not know. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. Only small droplets fell from the edge of the porch, steady and rhythmic like the ticking of a clock. Each drop was a second passing, and each passing second carried him further from the life he had once believed was his. He stepped into the yard, stopping where Elena's suitcase still lay. The leather was torn. Rain had soaked through, dampening what was inside: clothes, documents, fragments of a life Elena had carried for 3 years. Daniel bent down and touched the tear. A sharp pain rose in his chest, not because of the suitcase, but because of the moment he had thrown it away. The moment he believed he was reclaiming control. He did not know that in that very moment, he had lost everything. Somewhere deep inside him, a new fear began to form. Not the fear of losing money, not the fear of losing status, but something far deeper, far more frightening. The fear that, when he looked back, he would find no version of himself that he could respect. Elena was gone. She left without curses, without triumph. She left only an emptiness, large enough to force those who remained to face themselves. And that was the proper punishment? 7 months passed quietly. There were no sensational headlines, no images splashed across the media, no public statements issued. Elena's life, the woman who once stood in the rain beside a torn suitcase, had taken a different turn, so quietly it was almost invisible. Mornings in Portland began with the gentle scent of freshly roasted coffee drifting through a slightly open window. The sunlight was not harsh, just warm enough to touch the white walls of the small 2-bedroom apartment. Elena sat in an armchair near the window, one arm cradling her baby, the other turning the pages of a children's book. The baby slept peacefully in her arms, breathing softly, her scent carrying the warmth of milk and something deeply real. Calm. Sophia, the name Elena chose late one night when the city was asleep and she was not. The name carried no legacy, no echo of power. It was simply gentle enough for a child to grow without bearing the weight of expectations that were never meant to be hers. Elena moved to Portland under a different name, not to run away, but to breathe. She chose a quiet neighborhood where people greeted one another with just enough warmth, without curiosity or scrutiny. She drove an old car, 7 years old, the small scratch on the rear door still visible. No one saw it as a statement. It was simply transportation, precisely as she intended. In the afternoons, Elena pushed the stroller along tree-lined streets. Sophia often woke as the sun tilted westward, her clear eyes opening to take in the world as if memorizing it. Elena spoke to her daughter, sentences that required no reply, telling her about clouds, about leaves, about the neighbors' wind chimes that rang whenever the breeze passed through. On some days, Elena stopped in front of the small bookstore where she worked part-time. An old wooden sign, hand-painted letters, a clear glass door revealing neatly arranged shelves inside. She loved the moment of opening the shop in the morning. Morning, when the scent of paper and ink filled the air, when everything was still before customers arrived. There, no one called her an owner, a wife, or someone's daughter. She was simply Elena, the woman who arranged books, brewed coffee, and remembered which genres her regulars preferred. She liked that feeling. It was real. It had boundaries. And because of that, it felt safe. Some nights, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Elena sat on the living room floor with her back against the sofa, the soft yellow light washing over the room. She allowed her thoughts to drift back to the past, not to punish herself, but to look at it with a calm she had never known before. She remembered the 2-story house with its dim porch light, the rain, the moment she chose not to bend down and pick up the suitcase. Back then, she did not know what awaited her. She knew only one thing. If she stayed, she would lose herself. Now, in this small apartment, Elena began to understand that healing was not about forgetting. Healing was when memories no longer controlled your breathing, when you could remember and still live. She did not cut off contact with her parents, but the relationship had changed. There were no urgent calls, no plans, no schedules, just brief messages. I'm okay.
Sophia slept well. It's sunny today. At times her father wanted to visit. Elena said no, for now, not out of anger, but she needed to stand firmly on her own before allowing anyone else into this space. She learned to accept help on her own terms. A neighbor brought a meal over when Sophia had a mild fever. A brief check-in at the grocery counter, small gestures without obligation, things she had always lacked before. There were tiring days, nights when Sophia cried for no apparent reason, mornings when Elena looked at herself in the mirror, hair hastily tied back, no makeup, and wondered whether she was doing the right thing. Then Sophia would smile. An unconscious smile, wide and bright, as if the world, no matter how complicated, was still a place worth beginning in. Elena understood that this new life was not perfect. It was not glamorous. It was not certain. But it was hers. She began to rewrite her boundaries. No to things once considered normal but harmful. Yes to small things that nourished her. She learned to say, "I need time," without guilt. Learned to trust her instincts, the very intuition that had saved her more than once, even when she had tried to silence it. One late afternoon, as the last sunlight slanted through the window, Elena placed Sophia on the playmat. The baby stirred slightly and reached out, wrapping her tiny fingers around her mother's finger. The grip was gentle, but firm enough to anchor Elena in that moment. Elena leaned down and touched her forehead to her daughter's. She whispered, not a promise, but an acknowledgement. "I'm learning how to live better. For both of us." Outside, the city continued its rhythm. People passed by, arrived, and left, carrying their own stories. Elena no longer felt the need to explain, no need to prove anything. She was no longer invisible because she was dismissed. She chose anonymity because it was a form of freedom. And in that quiet, something new began to take root, slow, steady, and real. Not a grand love, not a new ambition, but a small belief that when a woman is brave enough to leave, patient enough to heal, life, in its own way, will find its way back. Not to compensate, but to continue. The pediatric clinic waiting room in the afternoon had its own unique rhythm, not rushed, yet not completely quiet. The soft rustle of paper as nurses flipped through charts, the gentle roll of stroller wheels across tiled floors, and, occasionally, the faint cry of a child, not from pain, but from exhaustion. Elena sat near the window, Sophia asleep in the carrier against her chest. The room was filled with soft light, enough to bring out the colorful murals of animals and drifting clouds. She glanced at the clock. Everything was running on schedule, a small thing, but one that brought a sense of reassurance. She had grown used to appointments like this, used to packing diapers, wipes, and bottles, used to waiting. She no longer felt trapped in these pauses. Now these quiet stretches were where she breathed. The voice at the reception desk suddenly lowered, tighter than usual. "I'm very sorry, sir," the nurse said, her hand resting lightly on the counter. "Without insurance, the clinic requires payment up front. That's the policy." Elena looked up instinctively. A man stood at the desk, early 30s, an old flannel shirt over a worn t-shirt. His shoulders leaned slightly forward, not from fatigue, but to shield the little girl in his arms. The child was about 4. Her cheeks were flushed, her head resting against her father's shoulder, her eyes heavy with fever. "She's had a high fever since this morning," the man said, his voice hoarse but still polite. "I called a few places. They were all fully booked. I just need a doctor to take a look at her." Elena watched the way he placed his hand on his daughter's back, steady, firm, a wordless anchor. She recognized the image at once. Someone standing at the edge of the system, needing help, unsure how to cross the line. She remembered the rainy night, remembered the feeling of being seen as a burden, and most of all,
She remembered the silence of those who could have helped, but chose not to. Elena stood. She walked to the desk, gentle yet decisive, as if she had practiced the movement in her mind long ago. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low but clear. "I can help." Both the man and the nurse turned. Their eyes carried the same question, soft but guarded. "I'd like to cover today's visit," Elena said. She did not look at the man, as if to spare him embarrassment. "If that's okay." No, that's not necessary," the man said quickly, shaking his head. "You don't know us. I can't." "She needs to see a doctor," Elena replied gently. "That's all." There was a brief pause, the kind where principles collide with compassion. Then the nurse nodded, as if she had made up her own mind. "All right," she said. "The doctor can take her now." The man bowed his head deeply. "Thank you," he said. I'll pay you back." "When you can," Elena answered. "Or help someone else when they need it." He looked at her then, really, taking in her appearance. Dark brown eyes, tired but bright, a rare kind of brightness, unshowy. He nodded. No promises, no pledges, just a nod, and Elena trusted he would honor it. They waited a few more minutes. The little girl was taken into the exam room. Sophia stirred in the carrier, opened her eyes briefly, then fell asleep again. Elena brushed her daughter's hair, an unconscious gesture. "Your baby?" the man asked softly, gesturing toward Sophia. "My daughter," Elena said. "Sophia." "She's beautiful," he said, "like her mother." The remark was simple, not flattering, not ingratiating, and precisely because of that, it reached her. They talked while waiting. Small fragments came together into a clear enough picture. He had moved to the city for a teaching job. His wife had passed away from illness 2 years earlier. He and his daughter were learning how to live again, one day at a time. He spoke of his child naturally, without dramatizing, without embellishment, just the truth of someone who had known loss and chosen to continue. When the doctor opened the door, announcing it was only an ear infection, prescribing medication and giving instructions, the man's face visibly softened. A long, quiet breath escaped him. He bent down and whispered to his daughter, forehead touching hers, a private moment that needed no witness. Elena paid discreetly at the counter. She knew the amount changed nothing in her life, but the look in the man's eyes, when he realized it was taken care of, did. It held a rare kind of relief, as if someone had lifted part of a burden he had grown used to carrying alone. They walked out to the parking lot simultaneously. The air was cool, a light breeze moved through. "Thank you," he said again. "My name's James." "Elena," she replied. He smiled, slightly shy but genuine. "If you don't mind, may I buy you a coffee? As a thank you. There's a place close by." Elena hesitated for a much brief beat, not from fear, but because she had learned to listen to her caution. Then she thought of the way he held his daughter, the uncalculating look in his eyes, the idea that kindness, once offered, did not have to be sealed away immediately. "All right," she said, "but just for a little while." The cafe was small and quiet. There was a play corner for children. James prepared milk for his daughter carefully, every movement deliberate, unhurried. Elena watched, not analyzing, simply noticing. She saw consistency in how he spoke, how he acted, how he showed up. They didn't talk much about the past. There was no need. They spoke of small things, children's books, sleep schedules, work, the tiny habits that make up a day. Ordinary things, and precisely because of that, precious. When they parted, James asked, "Could we meet again?" Elena smiled. No grand promise,
Maybe, she said. On the drive home, Sophia slept deeply. Elena drove slowly, streetlight gliding across the windshield. She thought about the moment at the reception desk, not because of what she had done, but because of how it felt afterwards. Not empty, not heavy, just warm. She realized something small yet important. Some people don't need to know who you are to treat you kindly. They only need to see that you are human. And sometimes, life doesn't repay you with grand gestures. It simply places the right moment in your hands. Enough for you to believe that, after everything, kindness still has a way forward. Elena whispered where no one could hear, "Thank you." Not to fate, but to the choice. Her own. Life rarely ends with a door slamming shut. Most of the time it ends very quietly, when you simply stop looking back. Elena stood by the window of the small apartment looking down at the street as the lights began to come on. Sophia slept in her crib, tiny hands curling softly with each breath. Portland in the evening was not loud, not ostentatious. It existed in its own way, just enough to make someone feel sheltered, just enough not to swallow you whole. Elena thought about the road she had taken. Not the road of revenge, not the road of loud, triumphant victory, but the road of leaving at the right time. She once believed that strength lay in endurance, that love meant tolerance, that if one were patient enough, people would change. But that rainy night taught her a different lesson, one that was not bitter but unmistakably clear. Some people do not change, not because they don't know they are wrong, but because they have never believed they needed to be right. Daniel, his mother, and even those who stood laughing beneath the porch light that night, they were not punished by power or money. They were punished by truth. By the time they had to continue living with the image of themselves, without Elena there to soften it. Elena no longer carried resentment. She had left it behind with the torn suitcase in the cold rain. Life afterwards did not turn into a fairy tale. James did not enter her life with promises of salvation. He entered with presence, steady, kind, and real. He did not ask who she had once been. He did not pry into the gaps in her story. He simply asked, "Are you okay today?" and listened to the answer. On some afternoons, Elena watched James play with the two children, Emma and Sophia, on the living room floor. No expensive toys, just a few books, a few laughs, a few silly stories. And in those tiny moments, Elena realized something she had never understood before. Real love doesn't make you feel lucky. It makes you feel normal, in the safest possible way. When Elena eventually told James the truth about who she was, not in a dramatic moment but on a quiet evening, he was silent for a long time. Not out of calculation, but because he needed to understand not the money, but the emotions. "I don't love you for who you are on paper," James said at last, his voice rough. "But I need to know that from now on, we don't have to test each other anymore." Elena nodded. She didn't want to test anyone ever again either, because some tests, once you've passed through them, never need to be repeated. They married in a small ceremony, no spectacle, no blinding lights. The two children laughed between the rows of chairs. Elena's parents stood quietly in the back, not intervening, not arranging, simply witnessing their daughter finally finding a place where she no longer had to hide any part of herself. Daniel read the news later, sometime during a very ordinary morning. There was no rage, no dramatic regret, just a long silence, where he understood that some losses cannot be measured in money, nor repaired by time. But this story was never about Daniel. It was about Elena. About a woman once mistaken for weak who chose silence not to endure, but to observe. About a woman who understood that the most incredible power is not making others fear you, but being able to leave without destroying anyone. Elena keeps a photograph in her small office, not at home, but at the place where she works for a community medical support foundation. It captures a moment from that clinic years ago. Elena at the reception desk, Sophia in a carrier, James holding Emma, who has a fever. No one in the photo knew what would come afterwards, but their expressions, concerned, kind, real, were enough. Elena often looks at that photo before starting her workday, to remember this. A life can change because of a single act of kindness, and sometimes the person who saves you from the dark is simply someone who does not turn away when you need them. Before turning off the light, Elena often whispers to Sophia as if speaking to herself. You don't have to be strong to deserve love. You just have to be yourself, with the right person. And that is this story. Not a story about wealth or poverty, not about revenge, but about character, about choice, and about the moment a person understands kindness is not weakness. It only becomes weak when it is given to the wrong place. If this story made you pause for a beat, if you saw yourself in Elena's silence or in Daniel's too late regret, I enjoy helping to spread a story of kindness. Please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they deserve more. And comment to let us know, how long will you choose silence before choosing yourself? Don't forget to subscribe to Deep Life Tales so we can keep telling stories about people where truth is not loud, but strong enough to change an entire life. Deep Life Tales, because sometimes the right story at the right time can save someone from staying where they no longer belong.